Continuing Cicero from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. He sailed from Athens for Asia and Rhodes. Amongst the Asian masters, he conversed with Xenocles of Adramyttium, Dionysius of Magnesia, and Medippus of Caria. At Rhodes, he studied oratory with Apollonius, the son of Milon, and philosophy with Posidonius. Apollonius, we are told, not understanding Latin, requested Cicero to declaim in Greek. He complied willingly, thinking that his faults would thus be better pointed out to him. And after he finished, all his other hearers were astonished and contended who should praise him most, but Apollonius, who had shown no signs of excitement whilst he was hearing him, so also now, when it was over, sat musing for some considerable time, without any remark. And when Cicero was discomposed at this, he said, "You have my praise and admiration, Cicero, and grace, my pity and commiseration," rumbling the tumbly here, since those arts and that eloquence which are the only glories that remain to her will now be transferred by you to Rome. And now when Cicero, full of expectation, was again bent upon political affairs, a certain oracle blunted the edge of his inclination for consulting the entity of Delphi, how he should attain most glory. The Pythonus answered, by making his own genius, and not the opinion of the people, the guide of his life. And therefore, at first, he passed his time in Rome cautiously, and was very backward in pretending to public offices, so that he was at that time in little esteem, and had got the names so readily given by low and ignorant people in Rome of Greek and scholar. But when his own desire of fame and the eagerness of his father and relations had made him take in earnest to pleading, he made no slow or gentle advance to the first place, but shone out in full lustre at once, and far surpassed all the advocates of the bar. At first, it is said, he, as well as Demosthenes, was defective in his delivery, and on that account paid much attention to the instructions sometimes of Roscius, the comedian, and sometimes of Aesop, the tragedian. They tell of this Aesop that whilst he was representing on the theatre Atreus deliberating the revenge of Estes, he was so transported beyond himself in the heat of action that he struck with his scepter one of the servants, who was running across the stage so violently that he laid him dead upon the place. And such afterwards was Cicero's delivery that it did not a little contribute to render his eloquence persuasive. He used to ridicule loud speakers, saying that they shouted because they could not speak, like lame men who get on horseback because they cannot walk, and his readiness and address in sarcasm, and generally in witty sayings, was thought to suit a pleader very well and to be highly attractive, but his using it to excess offended many, and gave him the repute of ill nature. He was appointed quaestor in great scarcity of corn, and had Sicula for his province, where, though at first he displeased many by compelling them to send in their provisions to Rome, yet after they had experience of his care, justice, and clemency, they honored him more than ever they did any of their governors before. I'm on the Tumblr here. I don't know if you can hear that. I can, it happened also that some young Romans of good and noble families, charged with neglect of discipline and misconduct in military service, were brought before the praetor in Sicala. Cicero undertook their defense, which he conducted admirably and got them acquitted. So returning to Rome with a great opinion of himself, for these things a ludicrous incident befell him, as he tells us himself, meeting an eminent citizen in Campania, whom he accounted his friend. He asked him what the Romans said and thought of his actions, as if the whole city had been filled with the glory of what he had done. His friend asked him in reply, "Where is it you have been, Cicero?" This, for the time, utterly mortified and cast him down to perceive that the report of his action had sunk into the city of Rome as into an immense ocean, without any visible effect or result in reputation, and afterwards considering with himself that the glory he contended for was an infinite thing, and that there was no fixed end nor measure in its pursuit, he made it much of his ambitious thoughts. Nevertheless, he was always excessively pleased with his own praise, and continued to the very last to be passionately fond of glory, which often interfered with the prosecution of his wisest resolutions. On beginning to apply himself more resolutely to public business, he remarked it as an unreasonable and absurd thing that artificers, using vessels and instruments inanimate, should know the name, place, and use of every one of them, and yet the statesmen, whose instruments for carrying out public measures are men, should be negligent and careless in the knowledge of persons. And so he not only acquainted himself with the names, but also knew the particular place where every one of the more eminent citizens dwelt, what lands he possessed, the friends he made use of, and those that were of his neighborhood. And when he traveled on any road in Italy, he could readily name and show the estates and seats of his friends and acquaintance. Having so small an estate, though a sufficient competency for his own expenses, it was much wondered at that he took neither fees nor gifts from his clients, and more especially that he did not do so when he undertook the prosecution of Verus. Now, it's not quite a gift when people are like, well, I don't charge a fee, but if you feel like making a donation to represent your gratitude for the success of the operation, or whatever, however they phrase that thing, this Verus, who had been praetor of Sicila and stood charged by the Sicilians of many evil practices during his government there. Every other government official nowadays, right? Except, oh, but they're of our political party, we can't let them be, Cicero succeeded in getting condemned, not by speaking, but in a manner by holding his tongue, for the praetors favoring Verus had deferred from the trial by several adjournments to the last day, in which it was evident there could not be sufficient time for the advocates to be heard, and the cause brought to an issue. Cicero, therefore, came forward and said there was no need of speeches, and after producing and examining witnesses, he required the judges to proceed to sentence. However, many witty sayings are on record as having been used by Cicero on the occasion, when a man named Cacilius, one of the freed slaves, who was said to be given to Jewish practices. Okay, trying to figure out what his name would be, right? Us is probably not it. Maybe Yah? Kakoya? I don't know what that would mean. Would have put by the Sicilians and undertaken the prosecution of Verus himself. Cicero asked, "What has a Jew to do with swine?" Verus being the Roman word for a boar. And when Verus began to reproach Cicero with effeminate living, "You ought," replied he, "to use this language at home to your sons." Verus, having a son who had fallen into disgraceful courses, Hortensius, the orator, not daring directly to undertake the defense of Verus, was yet persuaded to appear for him at the laying on of the fine, and received an ivory sphinx for his reward. When Cicero, in some passage of the speech, obliquely reflected on him, and Hortensius told him he was not skillful in solving riddles. "No," said Cicero, "and yet you have the Sphinx in your house." Verus was thus convicted, though Cicero, who set the fine at 75 mariads, maybe it just represents 10,000 as something else, right? Lay under the suspicion of being corrupted by bribery. To lessen the sum, but the Sicilians, in testimony of their gratitude, came and brought him all sorts of presents from the island, when he was a deal, of which he made no private profit himself, but used their generosity only to reduce the public price of provisions. He had a very pleasant seat at Arpi. He had also a farm near Pauls, and another about Pompeii, but neither of any great value. The portion of his wife, Terentia, amounted to 10 mariads, and he had a bequest valued at 9 mariads of denarii. Well, there's double I after Pompeii and in Pompeii and denarii. So, but he, giving you the usual pronunciation. Upon these he lived in a liberal but temperate style with the learned Greeks and Romans that were his familiars. He rarely, if at any time, sat down to meat till sunset, and that not so much on account of business as for his health and the weakness of his stomach. He was otherwise in the care of his body, nice and delicate, appointing himself, for example, a set number of walks and rubbings, and after this manner, managing the habit of his body, he brought it in time to be healthful and capable of supporting many great fatigues and trials. His father's house he made over to his brother, living himself near the Palatine Hill, that he might not give the trouble of long journeys to those that made suit to him. And indeed there were not fewer daily appearing at his door to do their court to him than there were that came to Crassus for his riches, or to Pompey for his power amongst the soldiers, these being at that time the 2 men of the greatest repute and influence in Rome. Nay, even Pompey himself used to pay court to Cicero, and Cicero's public actions did much to establish Pompey's authority and reputation in the state. Numerous distinguished competitors stood with him for the praetor's office, but he was chosen before them all and managed the decision of the causes with justice and integrity. It is related that Licinius Macer, a man himself of great power in the city, and supported also by the assistance of Crassus, was accused before him of extortion, and that in confidence on his own interest and diligence of his friends, whilst the judges were debating about the sentence, he went to his house, where, hastily trimming his hair and putting on a clean gown as already acquitted, he was setting off again to go to the forum, but at his hall door meeting Crassus, who told him that he was condemned by all the votes, he went in again, threw himself upon his bed, and died immediately. This verdict was considered very creditable to Cicero, as showing his careful management of the courts of justice. On another occasion, Vatinius, a man of rude manners and often insolent in court to the magistrates who had large swellings on his neck, came before his tribunal and made some request, and on Cicero's desiring further time to consider it, told him that he himself would have made no question about it had he been praetor. Cicero, turning quickly upon him, answered, "But I, you see, have not the neck that you have." When there were but 2 or 3 days remaining in his office, Manilius was brought before him and charged with peculation. Manilius had the good opinion and favor of the common people, and was thought to be prosecuted only for Pompey's sake, whose particular friend he was, and therefore when he asked a space of time before his trial, and Cicero allowed him but 1 day, and that the next only, the common people grew highly offended, because it had been the custom of the praetors to allow 10 days at least to the accused, and the tribunes of the people, having called him before the people and accused him, he, desiring to be heard, said that as he had always treated the accused with equity and humanity, as far as the law allowed, so he thought it hard to deny the same Manilius, and that he had studiously appointed that day, which alone as praetor he was master, and that it was not the part of those that were desirous to help him to cast the judgment of his cause upon another praetor. These things being said, made a wonderful change in the people, and commending him much for it, they desired that he himself would undertake the defense of Manilius, which he willingly consented to, and that principally for the sake of Pompey, who was absent, and accordingly taking his place before the people again, he delivered a bold invective upon the oligarchical party and on those who were jealous of Pompey. And nowadays it's all the parties, even the third parties, they're all for the oligarchs. Yet he was preferred to the consulship no less by the nobles than the common people for the good of the city, and both parties jointly assisted his promotion upon the following reasons: the change of government made by Sulla, which at first seemed a senseless one, by time and usage, had now come to be considered by the people no unsatisfactory settlement. But there were some that endeavored to alter and subvert the whole present state of affairs, not from any good motives, but for their own private gain, and Pompey being at this time employed in the wars with the kings of Pontus and Armenia. There was no sufficient force at Rome to suppress any attempts at a revolution. These people had for their head a man of bold, daring, and restless character, Lucius Catiline, who was accused, besides other great offences, of deflowering his virgin daughter. Well, it doesn't matter who's first, but if it wasn't consensual, that's a different story. And killing his own brother, for which latter crime, fearing to be prosecuted at law, he persuaded Sulla to set him down. Was their law against the first? Or was it just who was willing to fight over that sort of thing? He persuaded Sulla to set him down, as though he were yet alive, amongst those that were to be put to death by prescription. Well, if the first was rape, then either one should really be up for that, right? These men, this man, the profligate, citizens choosing for their captain, gave faith to one another, amongst other pledges, by sacrificing a man and eating of his flesh. And a great part of the young men of the city were corrupted by him, he providing for everyone's pleasure, drink, and women, and profusely supplying the expense of these debauchs. Etruria, moreover, had all been excited to revolt, as well as a great part of Gaul within the Alps. But Rome itself was in the most dangerous inclination to change on account of the unequal distribution of wealth and property. Well, that's always going to happen. But as far as what the state divides from its spoils, that's a different story. Those of highest rank and greatest spirit, having impoverished themselves by shows, entertainments, ambition of offices, and sumptuous buildings, and the riches of the city, having thus fallen into the hands of mean and low-born persons, so that there wanted but a slight impetus to set all in motion, it being in the power of every daring man to overturn a sickly commonwealth. Catiline, however, being desirous of procuring a strong position to carry out his designs, stood for the consulship and had great hopes of success, thinking he should be appointed with Caius Antonius as his colleague, who was a man fit to lead neither in a good cause nor in a bad one, but might be a valuable accession to another's power. These things the greatest part of the good and honest citizens apprehending, but Cicero, upon standing for the consulship, whom the people readily receiving, Catiline was put by, so that he and Caius Antonius were chosen, although amongst the competitors he was the only man descended from a father of the equestrian and not of the senatorial order. Though the designs of Catiline were not yet publicly known, and as considerable preliminary troubles immediately followed upon Cicero's entrance upon the consulship. For, on the one side, those who were disqualified by the laws of Sulla from holding any public offices, being neither inconsiderable in power nor in number, came forward as candidates, and caressed the people for them, speaking many things truly and justly against the tyranny of Sulla, only that they disturbed the government at an improper and unseasonable time. On the other hand, the tribunes of the people proposed laws by the same purpose, constituting a commission of 10 persons with unlimited powers, in whom the supreme governors should be vested the right of selling the public lands of all Italy and Syria, and Pompey's new conquest, of judging and banishing whom they pleased. Well, that should be upon what people have actually done, not, of planting colonies and taking monies out of the treasury, and of levying and paying what soldiers should be thought needful. And several of the nobility favored this law, but especially Caius Antonius, Cicero's colleague, in hopes of being one of the 10. But what gave the greatest fear to the nobles was that he was thought privy to the conspiracy of Catiline, and, not to dislike it because of his great debts, Cicero, endeavoring in the first place to provide a remedy against this danger, procured a decree assigning to him the province of Macedonia, he himself declining that of Gaul, which was offered to him, and this piece of favor so completely won over Antonius that he was ready to second and respond to, like a hired player, whatever Cicero said for the good of the country. And now, having made his colleague thus tame and tractable, he could, with greater courage, attack the conspirators, and therefore in the Senate, making an oration against the law of the 10 commissioners, he so founded those who proposed it, that they had nothing to reply. And when they again endeavored, and having prepared things beforehand, had called the consuls before the assembly of the people, Cicero, fearing nothing, went first out, and commanded the Senate to follow him, and not only succeeded in throwing out the law, but so entirely overpowered the tribunes by his oratory that they abandoned all thought of their other projects. For Cicero, it may be said, was the one man above all others who made the Romans feel how great a charm eloquence lends to what is good, and how invincible justice is, if it be well spoken, and that it is necessary for him who would dexterously govern a commonwealth in action always to prefer that which is honest before that which is popular, and in speaking to free the right and useful measure from everything that may occasion offense. An incident occurred in the theater during his consulship, which showed what his speaking could do. For whereas formerly the knights of Rome were mingled in the theater with the common people, and took their places amongst them as it happened, Marcus Otho, when he was praetor, was the first who distinguished them from other citizens and appointed them a proper seat, which they still enjoy as their special place in the theatre. This the common people took as an indignity done to them, and therefore when Otho appeared in the theatre, they hissed him. The knights, on the contrary, received him with loud clapping. The people repeated and increased their hissing. The knights continued their clapping. Upon this, turning upon one another, they broke out into insulting words, so that the theatre was in great disorder. Cicero, being informed of it, came himself to the theatre, and summoning the people to the temple of Bellona, he so effectually chid and chastised them for it, that again returning into the theatre, they received Otho with loud applause, contending with the knights who should give him the greatest demonstrations of honor and respect. The conspirators, with Catiline, at first cowed and disheartened, began to present to take courage again, and assembling themselves together, they exhorted one another boldly to undertake the design before Pompey's return, who, as it was said, was now on his march with his forces for Rome. But the old soldiers of Sylla were Catiline's chief stimulus to action. They had been disbanded all about Italy, but the greatest number and the fiercest of them lay scattered among the cities of Etruria, entertaining themselves with dreams of new plunder and rapine amongst the hoarded riches of Italy, these having for their leader Menelaus, who had served with distinction in the wars under Sulla, joined themselves to Catiline and came to Rome to assist him with her suffrages at the election, for he again pretended to the consulship, having resolved to kill Cicero in a tumult at the elections. Also the divine powers seemed to give intimation of the coming troubles by earthquakes, thunderbolts, and strange appearances. Nor was human evidence wanting concerning enough in itself, though not sufficient for the conviction of the noble and powerful Catiline. Yeah, imagine being convicted just because the earthquakes or the weather happened to coincide at a particular time or something. Therefore Cicero, deferring the day of election, summoned Catiline into the Senate, and questioned him as to the charges made against him. Catiline, believing that there were many in the Senate desirous of change, and to give a specimen of himself to the conspirators present, returned an audacious answer. What harm, said he, when I see two bodies, the one lean and consumptive with a head, the other great and strong without one? If I put a head to that body which wants one. This covert representation of the Senate and the people excited yet greater apprehensions in Cicero. He put on armor and was attended from his home by the noble citizens in a body, and a number of the young men went with him into the plain. Here, designedly letting his tunic slip partly off from his soldiers, he showed his armor underneath and discovered his danger to the spectators, who, being much moved at it, gathered round him for his defense. At length Catiline was, by a general suffrage, again put by, and Silanus and Murena chosen consuls.